The sea is dark tonight. Waves crash against longships carved with dragon heads, their sails catching a cold northern wind. Beyond the black horizon, a new world waits, a world that will soon tremble at the name of one man. His enemies would call him a cripple. His people would call him a legend. History would remember him as Ivar the Boneless. But before the world knew his name, before England burned and kings fled in terror, Ivar was just a child born to a prophecy and a curse. This is not a tale of an ordinary Viking. This is a story of how a boy who could not stand on his own legs rose to stand above all of his enemies. Ivar was born into blood and saga. His father was Ragnar Lothbrok, the most famous Viking of them all, raider of Paris, scourge of England, a man whose name was sung across the north like a thunderclap. Ragnar himself was a figure half real, half legend. Some say he wore a coat of wild animal skins and carried a spear blessed by Odin. Others say he was many men rolled into one myth. But for the people of Scandinavia in the 9th century, Ragnar was very real, and very dangerous. Ivar's mother was a slog, a woman as mysterious as she was beautiful. Some sagas claim she was the daughter of the legendary dragon slayer Sigurd and the shield maiden Brynhildr. Whether true or not, her bloodline was wrapped in myth. And with myth came prophecy. When Ragnar decided to lie with a slog, she warned him. "Do not take me tonight," she said, "for I have foreseen a child born crippled if you ignore this warning." But Ragnar, headstrong as always, did not listen. And so, from passion and prophecy, Ivar was born, a baby whose legs were weak and useless. His bones seemed like water. Some say his spine was twisted, others that he had a disease no one could name. Whatever the truth, the sagas say he had no bones at all. But from his earliest days, Ivar showed something no disease could break: his mind. Where his legs failed him, his brain and spirit burned bright. He listened to the skalds tell stories of gods and heroes, of Odin and Loki, of men who turned weakness into power. He studied every detail of ships, weapons, and war. Ragnar, though proud, feared his son's fate. In the Viking world, a warrior needed strength, speed, and steel. What future could a cripple have in a world of axes and blood? Yet a slog believed Ivar was destined for greatness. She insisted the boy be raised like his brothers, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake and Eye Hvitserk, and Ub, names that would themselves become legends. As a child, Ivar endured humiliation. Other boys mocked his twisted legs. Yet he fought back with words sharper than swords. He had an icy glare even as a boy, a look that silenced even the proudest warriors. They say he could remember every insult and repay it years later with a plan no one saw coming. He learned to crawl with his arms, to pull himself across the hall like a wolf dragging itself to a kill. His brothers helped him, but even they feared the cold fire in his eyes. The sagas describe a moment when young Ivar, still a boy, watched a game called Nefadafol, a Viking board game of war and strategy. Other boys played clumsily. Ivar watched once, then beat every opponent without even touching the pieces twice. "You will be the greatest tactician of us all," a slog whispered. "Even Odin will watch you." But destiny is not kind. As Ivar grew older, Ragnar's fame grew too, and with fame came enemies. Kings in England, priests in Francia, and even rival jarls in Scandinavia plotted revenge. And yet, at the center of it all was a boy who could not stand, staring at maps, memorizing the tides. The turning point came when Ragnar, restless and proud, decided to test England one more time. He had already raided it many times. Now he wanted to conquer it, to prove he was greater than any king. But fate was waiting. The English captured Ragnar and threw him into a pit of snakes. He died singing of Valhalla, his body writhing like the serpents. News of his death spread across the north like a storm. The sagas say when Ivar heard, he did not weep. He stared at the horizon and whispered a single word: vengeance. It was then that the crippled boy became something else. He gathered his brothers and spoke not as the weakest but as a leader. "We will raise the largest army the world has ever seen," he said. "We will sail to England. We will avenge our father." His brothers hesitated. How could a man who could not walk lead warriors into battle? But Ivar's voice burned with such conviction that even Bjorn Ironside, the strongest of them, nodded. And so the legend of the great heathen army began. Ships were built. Warriors were called from every fjord, from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Men who had never served together gathered under one banner, the banner of vengeance. And at its heart was a man who would never stand but who would make kings kneel. As the sails filled with wind and the longships cut across the sea, the skalds whispered, "The cripple leads the storm." In the hearts of the English, a new terror took root. Not Ragnar, not Bjorn, but Ivar the Boneless. The boy of prophecy had become a warlord. The man without bones was now the spine of an army. And the world was about to learn that weakness in the right hands can become the deadliest weapon of all. Winter had hardened the sea into steel, but still the longships sailed. Their carved dragon heads cut through icy spray, each ship crammed with men hungry for vengeance. This was no ordinary raid. This was the great heathen army, thousands of warriors from across the north, bound together by blood oaths and vengeance songs. At its heart sat a man who could not stand but who could bend the will of thousands. Ivar the Boneless. The English had grown used to Viking raids, quick strikes, burning villages, stolen treasures. They had grown complacent, believing the Northmen would never dare to truly conquer. But Ivar's fleet was different. It was not a handful of ships but a floating city of war, stretching from horizon to horizon. Even before they landed, the wind carried their chants across the water, deep, guttural, like wolves howling before a kill. In the year 865, they landed on the shores of East Anglia. The locals watched in stunned silence as wave after wave of warriors spilled onto the beaches. The English king offered them horses, thinking to buy peace. But Ivar only smiled, a cold, calculating smile that unnerved even his own men. He accepted the horses not as a gift but as weapons. His army now moved like a storm across the countryside, faster than any Viking force before. Ivar did not fight like other leaders. Where his brothers led from the front with sword and shield, he led from the mind. He studied the terrain, the tides, the weaknesses of every fortress. His warriors carried him on a shield or in a chariot, and from that vantage he became their living battle map. Some said he was like Odin himself, seeing the battlefield with one all-knowing eye. When the army reached Northumbria, the English finally realized the scale of the threat. The kings of the region, men who once mocked Ragnar, now faced his son. They tried to gather their forces. They tried to pray. But nothing could stop the storm. York, the jewel of Northumbria, fell quickly. Its walls crumbled under Ivar's tactics. Inside, the defenders fought bravely, but the great heathen army swarmed like ants over a carcass. Fires rose to the sky. Screams echoed through the narrow streets. For the first time, the English tasted true terror, a Viking army that came not to raid but to rule. And then came vengeance. Ragnar's killers, King Aella of Northumbria and his allies, were captured. The sagas describe a punishment so terrible that it echoes through history, the Blood Eagle. Whether legend or truth, they say Ivar ordered Aella to be laid face down, his ribs split open, his lungs pulled out to form the shape of wings, a living eagle carved from flesh. The English chroniclers wrote of it in horror, calling the Vikings demons, but to the Northmen it was justice. Thus dies the slayer of Ragnar, Ivar reportedly said, his voice colder than the North Sea. With Aella dead, Ivar's reputation transformed. He was no longer just a crippled warlord. He was a living nightmare. Stories spread across England of a man who could not walk but who commanded the wind and tide, who carved eagles from kings, who carried Odin's fury in his heart. Villagers fled at the mere sight of his banner, a black raven flying over blood-red cloth. Yet beneath the terror was genius. Ivar did not simply burn, he built. He established winter camps, something no Viking army had done before. He turned captured towns into fortresses. He taxed instead of plundering. He understood that to conquer you must not just destroy but control. His brothers fought for glory, Ivar fought for legacy. Still, his disability remained a constant shadow. He could not charge into battle like Bjorn Ironside. He could not wield an axe like Ub. But he wielded something more dangerous, patience. He outthought every opponent, predicted every move. Even his enemies admitted he was a master strategist. And yet, even as his legend grew, so did whispers. Some of his men said he was touched by the gods. Others said by demons. Some feared him, some worshipped him. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see through men's souls. In camp he spoke little, but when he did, his words cut like steel. He never forgot an insult, never forgave a betrayal. By 870, Ivar had carved a path of blood across England. Kings had fallen, monasteries burned, and the English were on their knees. The crippled boy from the fjords had become the scourge of an entire nation. But his story was far from over. His greatest victories were yet to come, and so were his greatest tragedies. Because as the sagas remind us, all power comes with a price. And even for Ivar the Boneless, destiny's blade cuts both ways. Smoke curled above the English countryside like black snakes in the sky. Where churches once stood, now only charred beams jutted from the earth. The great heathen army had not just raided England, it had sunk its claws into its soil. Villages that once paid tithes to priests now paid tribute to pagans. And at the center of it all sat a man who had turned weakness into a weapon, Ivar the Boneless. With King Aella dead and York in Viking hands, Ivar's army did not retreat to the sea as others had before. He built camps. He fortified towns. He took local women as wives for his men, blending Norse and Saxon bloodlines. What had begun as vengeance now became conquest. But conquest requires more than swords. It requires politics, and Ivar, crippled as he was, became a master of it. He met with Saxon nobles who feared him, promising them protection if they pledged loyalty. Some did. Those who didn't saw their halls burned to the ground. In this way he extended his reach without spilling as much blood as his brothers would have. His brothers, though, were not as patient. Bjorn Ironside longed to raid the Mediterranean. Up dreamed of ruling Denmark. Even Hvitserk began to whisper doubts. They had come to England for vengeance, but now they were bound to a cripple who ruled like a king. Some wondered if Ivar had gone too far. But Ivar was not just a leader of men, he was a reader of men. He knew their weaknesses, their hungers, their fears. In council, he sat on his carved throne, his twisted legs covered by fine furs, his piercing eyes scanning each face. Divide and rule, he muttered under his breath, a lesson he had learned from the sagas of Rome. And so he played his brothers like pieces on an ineffable board, moving them where he wanted, keeping them just loyal enough to stay. By 872, the great heathen army had split. Bjorn sailed south to plunder. Up took his men to Ireland. But Ivar stayed, his black raven banner still flying over English soil. The crippled boy was now the de facto ruler of Viking England. His rule was harsh but cunning. He built alliances with local chieftains. He married his warriors into Saxon families. He demanded tribute but allowed markets to flourish. In the eyes of some, he was not just a raider but a king, the first Viking king of England, though no crown rested on his brow. Yet power always brings enemies. Christian chroniclers painted him as a demon, a son of Satan crawling on twisted limbs, feasting on blood. Even some of his own warriors began to fear the aura around him. They whispered of strange rituals in his tent, of sacrifices to Odin, of a man who never smiled except when his enemies died screaming. And still the legend grew. English mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Be good, or Ivar the Boneless will come for you. His fame reached across the sea into the halls of Scandinavia. Even kings trembled when they spoke his name. But inside Ivar the fire burned hotter. He had avenged his father. He had conquered a land. Yet it was not enough. He wanted a kingdom no one could take from him. He wanted to be remembered not as Ragnar's crippled son but as Ivar the Great. And so he began to rule with an iron hand. Rebels were crushed. Dissenters were silenced. Even his brothers felt his wrath. In one saga, it is said he tricked one brother into an ambush and had him killed. Whether true or not, it reflected the growing shadow around him. Yet there were moments, brief, hidden moments, when the mask slipped. Alone in his hall, staring at the fire, he would shift uncomfortably, pain flashing across his face. His legs, twisted and weak, ached constantly. Some nights he could not sleep for the agony. He had built an empire, but his own body was still a prison. Still he endured. Pain is weakness leaving the body, he told his men. But he knew better. Pain for him was a companion. And like a companion it whispered, more, conquer more, rule more. By the late 870s, Ivar had become a shadow king over large parts of England. He had outlived enemies, crushed rivals, and carved his name into history. But as the sagas teach, every rise casts a long shadow. And soon even Ivar's brilliance would meet its test. Because far to the south, a new force was rising, one that even Ivar's mind might not defeat. And within his own camp, loyalty was fraying like an old sail. The cripple who had bent the world was about to face a storm he could not control. The winter winds swept across the English marshes, cold and relentless. They carried with them rumors of a Saxon prince who would not bow, of a leader who prayed as fiercely as he fought. His name was Alfred. To the Saxons he was a beacon. To the Vikings a thorn. To Ivar he would become a rival unlike any he had faced before. For years Ivar had ruled from York like a spider in its web. His reach extended from Northumbria to East Anglia, his warriors stationed in every stronghold. But as the 870s waned, the tides began to shift. The Saxons were learning. They were no longer easy prey. They built fortified towns ringed with walls and ditches, and trained armies that could move quickly, strike hard, and vanish. Alfred the Great was forging something new, a kingdom united by war. At first, Ivar dismissed Alfred as just another Saxon prince. But this was no ordinary foe. Alfred was patient, disciplined, and devout. He fought not for plunder but for survival, and that made him dangerous. The first clashes were small, skirmishes in the forests and fens, but they sent a message: England would not be Ivar's for the taking. Inside Ivar's camp, the seeds of doubt began to sprout. His brothers had long since left him, and those who remained were restless. They whispered that the crippled king had lost his edge. Some claimed the gods were turning against him. Others said his cruelty had gone too far. Still others looked to Alfred and wondered if the Saxons' god was stronger than Odin. Ivar, though, would not yield. He gathered new warriors from across the sea, promising them riches beyond imagining. He tightened his grip on his territories, imposing harsher tributes and stricter discipline. His eyes, once filled with fire, now burned with desperation. The boy who had outsmarted kings was becoming the man who could not stop fighting. But even a mind like Ivar's could not control everything. Rebellion flared in East Anglia. Saxon uprisings cut his supply lines. Some Viking jarls began making their own deals with Alfred, hedging their bets for the future. For the first time in years, Ivar felt something alien: isolation. In the sagas they say he began to have visions. Dark dreams of ravens circling over his own body, of the All-Father turning his face away. Whether true or not, the legend stuck. His enemies called him the Demon of York, but now the demon was bleeding. By 878, Alfred had rallied the Saxons at Edington, a battle that would mark the turning point of the war. Ivar himself may not have been there. Some sources say he had already withdrawn, others that he fought and lost. But either way, the tide turned. The great heathen army fractured. Some Vikings settled under treaties, others returned to Scandinavia. The dream of a Viking England was fading. And Ivar? The man who had turned weakness into a throne began to fade with it. His power shrank. His allies deserted him. His body, always a source of pain, grew weaker still. Yet he refused to vanish quietly. In one saga, he makes a final stand in Ireland, ruling as a warlord until his death. In another, he dies in England, buried beneath a mound so feared that later kings would not dare disturb it. What we know is this: when he died, the people who found his grave were terrified. Chroniclers wrote that his bones were as strong as iron, that no man could destroy them. 4 years after his burial, no enemy dared set foot near it, until one finally did, and the protection ended. Thus ended Ivar the Boneless, the cripple who had bent the world. Not in a blaze of glory, but as a shadow whose legend refused to die. His name still echoes, a man who took what he was given and made it terrifying. The sky over the Irish Sea was grey and endless, the kind of sky that seemed to swallow ships whole. In the winter of 873, Ivar the Boneless arrived on foreign shores once again, but this time not as a conqueror seeking new kingdoms, but as a man retreating from a dream that had begun to crumble. The sagas are not clear about what drove him there. Some say Alfred's rise in England had left him with no choice. Others whisper of betrayal among his own, of poison, of gods who had turned their backs that in Ireland. He rebuilt what he could. Dublin, already a Viking stronghold, became his base. From there, he raided the Irish kingdoms with the same cunning he had once used in England. But something was different. His army was smaller, his body weaker. The man who had terrified Saxons and kings now found himself fighting to hold scraps of land on a wild, hostile coast. The chroniclers call him Imar, and they write that his power in Ireland was vast and terrible. But beneath the lines of ink, you can sense it: this was Ivar's last act. His health, always fragile, began to fail. In the sagas, he laughs at his enemies, claiming he will not die until the moment suits him. In one story, he orders his warriors to lay him on the battlefield so he can command from the ground, crawling like a serpent, striking at his foes. In another, he demands to be buried in a place of power, a burial so charged with curses and blessings that no enemy would dare disturb it. And then in 873 or 874, the chronicles say simply, Imar died. No great battle, no heroic duel, just death. But death was not the end of his legend. That the place of his burial became a mystery. Some say it was in England in a barrow near Repton. Others insist it was in Dublin. The mound at Repton, uncovered by archaeologists centuries later, revealed a mass grave of Viking warriors and a single body laid apart, surrounded by weapons. The skeleton's legs were deformed. Could it be him? If it was, the stories of what happened after his burial are even stranger. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims that for years, no enemy dared cross the field where he lay. It was said that his bones, hard as iron, cursed the ground, protecting it from invasion. Only when a king of England later dug up the grave, scattering the bones, Did the land lose its magical protection? Whether myth or fact, it tells you something about how his enemies saw him. Even in death they feared him. Even in the grave, he was still Ivar the Boneless, a man who had turned his weakness into a weapon, who had carved out kingdoms from pain, and yet what lingers most is not the fear but the complexity. The sagas paint him as a monster, a demon who laughed as he killed. But they also paint him as brilliant, strategic, and strangely tragic. A boy mocked for his deformity who refused to accept the fate the world handed him. His legacy would echo for centuries. The Danelaw he helped establish in England shaped the culture of the land long after his death. The Viking kingdoms of Dublin and York, seeded by his campaigns, became powerful hubs of trade and politics. Even Alfred the Great, his greatest rival, built his reforms in response to Ivar's invasions. In a way, Ivar helped create the very England that resisted him. Today we remember him as a symbol. Of cruelty, yes. Of conquest, yes. But also of defiance. Of the idea that power can come from places no one expects. A cripple who outwitted kings. A man whose name still sends a chill across 1,000 years. When Ivar died, the earth trembled. When Ivar was buried, the ground would not hold another. And when Ivar's bones were scattered, the gods themselves sighed. Whether you believe it or not, one thing is certain. Ivar the Boneless lives on. In our myths. In our fears. In our fascination with those who rise against the odds, and leave the world forever changed. History is written with ink, but legends are written with fire. And when it comes to Ivar the Boneless, the fire still burns. We have told you about his rise, his conquests, and his death. But there are whispers, strange tales and hidden fragments, that paint an even darker, more fascinating picture of the crippled king. Some say his condition was no ordinary disease. The sagas speak of a prophecy, a child born with dragon's blood, cursed to crawl but blessed to conquer. Could Ivar's deformity have been seen not as weakness, but as a mark of the gods? In a world of omens and runes, such things mattered. His mother, a slog, claimed descent from the dragon slayer Sigurd and the shield maiden Brynhild. Perhaps the boy who could not walk was destined for a different kind of power. Others whisper that his cruelty was a mask. The sagas love their villains, but behind every act of terror there may have been strategy. Blood eagle executions and mass burnings made his name echo far and wide. But they also served a purpose: psychological warfare. By making himself a monster, he broke his enemy's spirits before the battle even began. Then there are the bones. Archaeologists at Repton unearthed a mass grave of Vikings, and one body apart, taller than most, with twisted legs. Was this Ivar? The skeleton was surrounded by axes, swords, and treasures, buried with a reverence rare even for a king. But there is more. The grave showed signs of ritual: stones, animal bones, charms. As if his followers believed he carried power into the next life. As if they feared what would happen if they buried him wrong. And what of the curse? The Anglo-Saxon chronicle hints that as long as Ivar's bones lay undisturbed, no enemy dared cross the field. When a later king scattered them, that protection vanished. Coincidence? Or did the crippled king leave something behind? A legacy of fear strong enough to shape actions decades after his death? Even his name holds mystery. Ivar the Boneless. But some scholars argue it may have meant Ivar the Snake, or Ivar the Flexible. A man who could slip through traps, who could bend without breaking. Others think he may have worn leather braces or wooden contraptions to move in battle, crawling forward like a beast, terrifying his enemies not just with cruelty but with sheer will. And in the north they tell one last story. That before he died, Ivar carved runes into his own grave, promising to rise if his people ever called upon him. That the ravens who circle Repton are not birds at all, but the spirit of Ivar watching. That his mind still wanders the fields he once conquered. Myths? Probably. But myths endure for a reason. They tell us not just about the man but about the world that made him. A world where a crippled boy could become a warlord, where fear was a weapon as sharp as steel, where death could not silence a name. And so, centuries later we still speak his. Ivar the Boneless. Monster, strategist, cripple, king. The boy who could not walk, but whose shadow still marches across history.